It was the night of September 11th, 2001. The city that never sleeps was drowning in silence, a silence filled with smoke, fear, and disbelief. While the world's eyes were fixed on Lower Manhattan, where 2 towers had just fallen, another tragedy was quietly unfolding miles away in Brooklyn. A man named Henryk Siwiak, a 46-year-old Polish immigrant, walked through the dim streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant. He was lost, trying to find his way to a new job. But before he could make it there, someone stepped out of the shadows. A gunshot echoed through the night. No cameras caught it. No one saw who pulled the trigger. And in the chaos of America's darkest day, Henryk became a forgotten victim of 9/11, the only homicide recorded in New York City that night. His name was Henryk Siwiak, a father, a husband, a man who came to America searching for a better life. He had left behind his family in Krakow, Poland, hoping that New York City, the city of opportunity, would give him a chance to start fresh. Henryk didn't speak much English, but he was determined. He found small jobs, worked long hours, and dreamed of bringing his wife and children to the United States. He believed in hard work, in honesty, and in the promise that effort could build a future. But on the night the world changed forever. When chaos consumed New York, Henryk's story became something else entirely. Amid the smoke, the confusion, and the fear, his life was taken, his death unnoticed. While millions mourned the victims of the towers, one man's quiet murder faded into the background of history. Henryk Siwiak had arrived in New York just a year before the attacks. Back in Poland, he'd worked as a railway inspector. Steady work, a good reputation, a simple life. But like many immigrants, he wanted something more. America was supposed to be his restart, a place where hard work could rewrite a man's destiny. He lived in Queens, renting a small apartment, sending money home to his wife and 2 children. He didn't complain, even when things got hard. English was a struggle, but Henryk was resourceful. He studied phrases, asked questions, and smiled his way through confusion. His friends said he had the kind of optimism that refused to die, even when the city around him grew cold. When the Twin Towers fell on the morning of September 11th, Henryk was among the many who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The city was paralyzed, transportation shut down, fear everywhere. But Henryk still had to survive. He still had bills, rent, and a family waiting back home. That evening, he got word of a temporary night shift cleaning a grocery store in Brooklyn. It wasn't much, but to Henryk, it was a chance, a way to keep moving forward when the world stood still. He ironed his shirt, packed his work ID, and stepped out into the night, determined to prove that life could still go on. He couldn't have known that this small act of courage, walking to a new job through a city gripped by fear, would lead him straight into the unknown. That night, the city felt like another world. The air was thick with the smell of smoke drifting from Lower Manhattan. Subways were silent, streets were deserted, and fear hung like fog over New York. Henryk Siwiak stepped off the train in Brooklyn, directions scribbled on a small piece of paper. He was headed for a neighborhood he didn't know, Bedford-Stuyvesant, a place many New Yorkers avoided after dark. But Henryk wasn't afraid. He believed if he kept walking, someone would help him find the right street. He wore camouflage pants and carried a black backpack, work clothes that, to him, were practical. But in that tense night when the whole city was on edge, it may have made him stand out in ways he couldn't have understood. He stopped to ask for directions, but no one answered. Doors stayed shut. Windows stayed dark. People were too afraid to open up to a stranger when the world itself felt under attack. Sometime around midnight, a gunshot broke the silence. Just one. Neighbors later said they heard it echo down Decatur Street. Then footsteps, quick and uneven. Henryk, bleeding and disoriented, staggered forward, trying to call for help. He collapsed on the steps of a brownstone, pressing the intercom with his last strength. By the time someone looked outside, he was already gone. His blood pooled on the doorstep of a stranger's home, a man who had come to America for safety, dying alone in a city too distracted to notice. On that night of terror and tragedy, While the world mourned thousands, Henryk Siwiak became the forgotten victim of 9/11, the only homicide recorded in New York City that day. When police finally arrived on Decatur Street, it was nearly an hour after the gunshot. The city was still in a state of emergency. Officers were scattered across Manhattan, working around the clock in the aftermath of the attacks. Brooklyn's call for help that night was barely a whisper against the roar of national tragedy. Henryk Siwiak lay where he had fallen, his wallet untouched, money still in his pocket, watch still on his wrist. There were no signs of struggle, no sign of robbery. Just one fatal gunshot wound, clean, deliberate, and unexplained. The detectives who did arrive quickly realized how impossible their task was. No one had seen anything. No cameras were working in the area. The few who had heard the shot refused to come forward. In a city paralyzed by fear, no one wanted to get involved. Even the evidence was scarce. There was no murder weapon, no shell casing, no footprints that could tell the story of what really happened on that street. Every clue felt swallowed by the smoke and confusion of that night. For investigators, it was as if Henryk had vanished into the chaos. Another casualty of a day already defined by loss. But unlike the thousands who died at Ground Zero, his death didn't make headlines. There were no vigils, no public mourning, no closure. The file was opened, stamped, and quietly forgotten in the overwhelming tide of tragedy. And just like that, Henryk Siwiak's murder slipped into silence, a mystery buried beneath the ashes of 9/11. In the years that followed, detectives would return to Henryk Siwiak's case, hoping that time might reveal what chaos had buried. But every time they reopened the file, they faced the same haunting question. Why? One theory was mistaken identity. Some believed Henryk's camouflage clothing, his accent, and his nervous walk through an unfamiliar neighborhood on a night of fear might have made him a target. People were tense, suspicious, and ready to assume the worst. Maybe someone thought he was connected to the attacks. A tragic misunderstanding in a city on edge. Another theory, a random street crime. Bedford-Stuyvesant at the time was still known for its rough streets. Some detectives wondered if it was just bad luck, Henryk caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that theory never fully made sense. His money was untouched, his belongings left behind. If it was a robbery, why take nothing? Others whispered darker possibilities. A hate crime driven by fear and ignorance. Henryk's Polish accent, his foreign look, the tension of that night. Maybe someone lashed out blindly, fueled by panic and prejudice. Journalists, who revisited the story years later, described it as a case swallowed by tragedy. Even Henryk's family in Poland struggled to understand how a man could be murdered in one of the most heavily policed cities in the world, and yet have his case forgotten. His sister, Lucina, once said in an interview, "He survived the war, he survived communism, but he didn't survive New York." Detectives still have no answers. Every possible motive leads to another dead end, and somewhere between fear, coincidence, and human cruelty. The truth about Henryk's death remains lost in the smoke of that night. For Henryk's family in Poland, the news came slowly. A phone call from across the ocean that shattered everything. They had been watching the same images of the Twin Towers fall, praying for the people of New York, never imagining that their own loved one would become part of that same day's tragedy. But not as a victim of terrorism, as a victim of something quieter, colder, and far more personal. They waited for answers that never came. There was no trial, no suspect, not even a clear motive. Just official silence and a single report that said, "Homicide, Brooklyn, September 11th. That one line was all the world recorded of Henryk Siwiak's death. For his wife and children, the grief was doubled. Not only had they lost a husband and father, but his story seemed invisible, forgotten beneath the shadow of global mourning. There were no headlines, no ceremonies, no flags lowered for him. Detectives would occasionally revisit the case, hoping new evidence might surface. But time only deepened the silence. Witnesses moved, memories faded, and the city carried on. Henryk Siwiak became a footnote in history, remembered, if at all, it as the only murder in New York City on September 11, 2001. But to his family, he was never a statistic. He was a man who came with hope, who worked hard, who believed in a better life, and who vanished into the noise of the very country he came to trust. In a day that defined loss for millions, Henryk's story remains a reminder of another kind of tragedy, the kind that doesn't make headlines but still breaks hearts.